The streets of the city had always been under the control of a ruthless gang. They ran businesses into the ground, stole from anyone who dared oppose them, and terrorized the neighborhood with a reign of fear. No one dared challenge them. Not even the police. Their leader, Jimmy, was known for his cruelty, quick temper, and brutal tactics. He ruled with an iron fist, believing no one could stand against him. But on one stormy night, the gang found themselves in the presence of someone they underestimated, Steven Seagal. It was a typical evening at a local dive bar, the kind of place where the city's underworld gathered. The gang had taken over the back booth, celebrating another successful night of deals and intimidation. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of clinking bottles drowned out the low hum of chatter. Jimmy, seated at the head of the table, scanned the room with the arrogance of someone who believed the world revolved around him. That was when Seagal walked in, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans. His face calm, his presence barely noticed at first. He stepped into the bar like he belonged there. The door creaked, and the cold air followed him in. He approached the bar with quiet confidence, his every movement measured and deliberate. The gang barely paid him any attention at first. After all, what was one more person in a bar full of drunks and lowlifes? But Jimmy noticed. His eyes narrowed as he watched the stranger from across the room. Something didn't feel right. The man had the calm, collected air of someone who wasn't fazed by anything. Not the noise, not the tension, not the dangerous people in the room. It was as if he had a secret, an air of quiet power that made Jimmy uneasy. One of Jimmy's men nudged him, whispering in his ear, "That guy, something about him doesn't sit right." Jimmy grinned, dismissing the feeling. "Relax. He's just another nobody. Watch this." He stood up and swaggered over to Seagal, ready to show him who was in charge. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. It was a cold, rainy evening when Steven Seagal walked into the worn-down bar. The dimly lit establishment seemed to absorb the faint hum of the city outside, leaving behind a stagnant air of smoke and stale beer. It was the kind of place where trouble came and went in equal measure, where people knew their place and rarely strayed from it. Behind the counter, the bartender wiped down the same spot for the third time, clearly bored and used to the quiet rhythm of the bar. At the back booth, Jimmy, the leader of the gang, surveyed his kingdom. His dark, sinister eyes swept over the room with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. His gang, a group of rough-looking men with tattoos and sneers, filled the space with their rowdy conversations, their laughter punctuated by occasional bursts of harsh profanity. They were celebrating a successful day of busyness, extorting local shopkeepers, intimidating anyone who crossed them, and doing what they did best, making money through fear. Jimmy, sitting at the head of the table, was enjoying the feeling of power. He leaned back, his gold chain glinting in the low light as he flashed a grin at his men. His bravado was unmistakable, and he wasn't shy about flaunting his position. He reveled in the fear he inspired, the respect he demanded without asking for it. When Seagal walked in, it took a moment for anyone to notice. He wasn't loud or brash, and he wasn't wearing anything that screamed danger. Just an unassuming jacket, a simple pair of jeans, and a calm expression. He wasn't trying to draw attention, but somehow his presence seemed to demand it. People in the bar shifted slightly in their seats, noticing the man as he walked toward the counter. His movement was fluid, almost graceful, like someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes of silence. Someone who knew how to move with purpose. Jimmy glanced up from his conversation with one of his lieutenants, his gaze narrowing in mild curiosity. He didn't like the way the stranger carried himself. There was something about his demeanor that suggested he wasn't afraid of anyone. Jimmy didn't like being around people who weren't afraid of him. He stood up, adjusting his leather jacket and cracking his knuckles as he made his way towards Seagal. The room seemed to quiet down as Jimmy approached, and Seagal, as if sensing the sudden attention, turned just slightly. He nodded to Jimmy, but didn't say anything. His calm, almost disinterested look only deepened Jimmy's suspicion. "You new around here." Jimmy's voice was gruff, laced with the unmistakable arrogance of someone used to being in control. "This is my bar. My block. You got something to say? Or do you just walk in here and expect people to cater to you?" Seagal met his gaze, his expression unchanged. "Just here for a drink," he said quietly. His voice was calm, measured, completely unbothered by Jimmy's aggressive stance. Jimmy smiled, sensing an opportunity to assert his dominance. "Oh, you're here for a drink, huh?" He stepped closer, towering over Seagal. "You know, this bar's for real men, people who've got something to back them up, people who don't look like they're lost." Seagal didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if he'd heard this kind of talk 1,000 times before and wasn't moved by it. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said softly. "Just a drink." Jimmy laughed, his men following suit. They all found it amusing. A stranger, clearly not from the area, thinking he could just walk in and be left alone. Jimmy thought he was going to teach this guy a lesson, show him who was really in charge. He snapped his fingers at one of his men. "Get this guy a drink," he ordered, with a smirk. "Let's see if he can even handle it." The thug handed Seagal a drink, but Jimmy wasn't done yet. He leaned in even closer, his face inches from Seagal's. "You know," he said with a slow grin, "I think you've got the wrong idea. People like you don't just stroll into places like this without paying the price. You get me?" Seagal's eyes flickered to Jimmy's face, his gaze sharp as a knife. "I understand perfectly." Jimmy took that as an invitation to escalate things. He stepped back, glancing at his gang, who had already begun to stand up, sensing the tension in the air. Jimmy snapped his fingers again, and one of his men, a massive figure with a shaved head, moved toward Seagal as if to intimidate him further. The room grew tense, and the laughter died down. The patrons of the bar watched, waiting for something to explode. "All right, old man," Jimmy said, his tone low and dangerous. "Let's see if you're as tough as you look. You think you can just walk in here and disrespect me and my guys? Not happening." Seagal didn't blink, didn't react. His eyes were steady, locked on Jimmy. "I'm not here for a fight," he said again, his voice calm but firm. "But if you want one, I'll give you one." Jimmy's eyes narrowed. His pride wouldn't let him back down. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he sneered. "But guts don't mean a thing when you're up against me." With that, he nodded to his men. They surrounded Seagal, their hands flexing as they prepared for a confrontation. But Seagal wasn't fazed. He wasn't interested in playing the role of the helpless victim, and he wasn't going to let a bunch of punks intimidate him. He was about to show them exactly what it meant to underestimate the wrong person. The bar went silent, all eyes on the scene unfolding in front of them. And then the chaos began. The tension in the bar was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy and his men stood poised, ready to make their move. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the flickering light from the overhead bulbs casting long shadows across the space. Even the bartender, who had witnessed more than his fair share of trouble, seemed to pause, his eyes shifting nervously from Jimmy to Seagal. Jimmy's gang members circled around Seagal, sizing him up. They were used to overpowering their targets with sheer numbers and force. The biggest of the thugs, a mountain of muscle with a tattoo that ran down his neck, was the first to step forward. His footsteps were heavy, and his fists were already clenched. He cracked his knuckles, a grin spreading across his face. "You're outnumbered, old man," he sneered, towering over Seagal. "Think you can handle all of us?" Seagal didn't even look at the thug. He simply turned his head, glancing over his shoulder at the gang that surrounded him, his eyes cold and calculating. "You might have the numbers, but you're forgetting one thing," Seagal said, his voice calm and unwavering. "Power doesn't come from strength alone. It comes from control." Before anyone could react, Seagal made his move. It was almost imperceptible at first. A blur of movement, a twist of his body, and in an instant, his hand shot out and grabbed the wrist of the thug closest to him. The thug, shocked by how fast Seagal was, tried to pull away, but Seagal's grip was like iron. In one smooth motion, Seagal twisted the thug's arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The thug grunted in pain, his face twisted in confusion and disbelief. The other men, momentarily stunned by the speed of the move, hesitated. Seagal didn't give them time to think. With a swift spin, he kicked the nearest thug in the stomach, sending him crashing into a table. The loud crash of wood splintering filled the room, but the noise was drowned out by the stunned gasps of the onlookers. Seagal's movements were so fluid, so precise. It was as if he was dancing. Jimmy's face twisted into a snarl. He wasn't going to let this man make a fool out of him. "Get him!" he shouted. 2 more men lunged forward, but they weren't ready for Seagal's skill. He sighed, stepped the first, grabbing his arm and pulling him into an elbow strike to the face. The second thug swung a punch, but Seagal ducked under it, delivering a powerful knee to the man's midsection. The thug collapsed, gasping for air, his legs giving out beneath him. Jimmy stood in the background watching his gang get dismantled one by one. His gang wasn't weak by any stretch of the imagination. They were hardened street fighters, used to picking on those they thought they could dominate. But this wasn't just another fight. This man, Seagal, was something else entirely. Seagal barely broke a sweat as he continued to disarm and disable the remaining thugs. One of them lunged at Seagal with a broken bottle, aiming for his neck. Seagal caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with a force that made the thug drop the bottle, his face contorting in pain. With one fluid motion, Seagal shoved the thug into a stack of chairs, knocking him unconscious. The last thug standing, the same one who had first tried to intimidate Seagal, looked around the room, his face pale as he realized the tables had turned. He reached for a gun tucked in his waistband, but Seagal was faster. In a flash, Seagal grabbed his arm, twisting it with such force that the gun fell to the floor with a clatter. The thug's face was now a mix of fear and disbelief. You're a damn monster," he stammered, struggling to free himself. Seagal didn't flinch. He didn't need to prove anything. He simply let go of the thug's arm, sending him stumbling backward into the counter. "The only monster here," Seagal said, his voice cold, "is the one you created." Jimmy, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, finally found his voice again. His arrogance had been shattered. His gang was falling apart, his men writhing on the floor in various states of unconsciousness or pain. He was furious, but deep down he knew he'd made a critical mistake. He took a step forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "I didn't walk in here to fight," Seagal interrupted, his voice low and steady. "I walked in here to remind you that power doesn't come from violence. It comes from respect." Jimmy sneered, but his confidence was gone. He could see now that Seagal wasn't just some old man to be pushed around. He was a trained fighter, someone who had mastered control, discipline, and the art of combat in ways that Jimmy could never hope to understand. Seagal took a step forward, his eyes locking with Jimmy's. "You wanted to make an example of me," Seagal said quietly, "but all you've done is make an example of yourself." Jimmy opened his mouth to say something, but he was cut off by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. One of Seagal's attackers, a gang member who had stayed on the sidelines throughout the confrontation, stood up shakily. He winced in pain but looked at Seagal with newfound respect. "Boss, I don't think we're winning this one." Jimmy glared at him. Then, at the men lying on the ground around them. The reality of the situation hit him hard. The gang that had once ruled the streets was no match for Seagal. They had thought he was weak, just another person they could push around. But they were wrong. The last thug, groaning in pain, clutched his stomach and whispered, "This guy, he's not normal." Seagal looked around the room, his gaze cold and unwavering. "The problem with people like you," he said quietly, "is that you mistake silence for weakness. But the strongest people in this world don't have to scream to make themselves heard." Seagal stood tall, his presence overwhelming. The bar was silent except for the faint sound of gasping breath and the occasional groan from a thug trying to regain his bearings. Jimmy's gang, broken and humiliated, had no choice but to retreat. They couldn't fight Seagal. They wouldn't win. And in that moment, Seagal had shown them exactly what true strength looked like. Silent, precise, and unyielding. The air in the bar was thick with the sound of heavy breathing, and the smell of smoke mixed with the sharp tang of spilled alcohol. Jimmy and his men lay scattered across the room, nursing bruises and cuts. The thugs who had moments before been so confident in their intimidation tactics were now silent. Their pride shattered, their bodies sprawled across the floor in various states of discomfort. Some whimpered, others groaned in pain, but all of them were stunned. The one man who had just moments ago swaggered into the bar with the full arrogance of a gangster was now barely able to stand. Seagal stood motionless, a picture of calm. His movements had been swift, precise, and deliberate, leaving the gang members broken in the wake of his silent power. There were no taunts, no dramatic showdowns, just the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. His eyes swept over the room, assessing the damage before settling on Jimmy. Jimmy, on his knees, hands pressed against the ground as he tried to push himself up, was now a far cry from the confident man who had once ruled this space with terror. His face was a mix of pain and disbelief, his gold chain now lying on the floor, a symbol of his lost arrogance. Seagal didn't look down at him, though. He didn't even bother to speak. Instead, he turned his attention to the others in the room, the ones who had witnessed the chaos unfold. The bartender, who had seen his fair share of tough guys over the years, was wide-eyed, his mouth agape. The other patrons, a mixture of regulars and newcomers, had all been frozen in shock, eyes wide as they watched the once feared gang reduced to nothing. In the corner of the room, a man who had been quietly sipping his drink now set it down, watching the destruction in awe. A young woman sitting at the bar had her phone out, recording the entire thing, or at least what was left of it. It was almost as if everyone in the bar knew this wasn't just a typical fight. It was something deeper, something that carried with it a lesson that would be remembered long after the bruises healed. Seagal slowly made his way toward the door. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. He didn't need to make a grand exit. He had already said everything with his actions, and the lesson had been made clear. As his hand reached for the door, he turned one last time to address the room, his voice low, but carrying the weight of someone who had lived through things most people could never understand. "You see," Seagal said, his gaze sweeping over the remnants of the gang, "this is the problem with arrogance. It blinds you. It makes you think you are untouchable. You think because you've got a group of men behind you, or a reputation that you've built through fear, that nothing can touch you. But the truth is, power isn't about fear. It's about control. It's about knowing when to strike and when to walk away." The room was dead silent. Everyone knew exactly what Seagal meant. Jimmy and his gang had believed their power came from their violence and intimidation. They thought they were untouchable, because they ruled by force. But they had learned the hard way that true strength wasn't measured by the size of your fist or the number of your allies. It was measured by your ability to remain calm, to act with purpose, and to never let anyone, not even the loudest bully in the room, push you around. "Remember this," Seagal continued, his eyes now focused on Jimmy, still struggling to rise. "You might control a block or a bar. You might intimidate people into obeying you. But the moment you lose control of yourself, you lose everything." Jimmy winced as he tried to stand. But he was trembling now. It wasn't from the physical pain, though, that was certainly there. No, it was from something far deeper. It was from the realization that all the power he thought he had was nothing in comparison to the calm force he had just witnessed. Seagal looked toward the back of the room, where a lone figure stood near the corner. The old clerk, who had been quietly watching the whole ordeal. The clerk had never flinched, never made a sound. Unlike the others who had been frozen in fear or wide-eyed with shock, the clerk had maintained a quiet dignity, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. Seagal's eyes softened slightly as he walked over to him. The clerk, now standing with his hands folded in front of him, looked at Seagal with a mix of confusion and curiosity. "You're different," Seagal said simply. "You didn't show fear. You didn't look down or cower." The clerk nodded slowly. He had seen enough in his years to know that violence, while inevitable in some cases, was never the solution. He'd witnessed the gang's cruelty for months. The way they bullied customers. The way they took what they wanted without a second thought. But when Seagal had walked in, he had known this man was different. He hadn't been fazed by the gang's bravado, nor had he been intimidated by their threats. "I've seen a lot in my time," the clerk said quietly, his voice shaking just a little. "But never anything like that." Seagal looked at him for a moment, considering his words. Then, without a hint of emotion, he said, "You're the kind of man who knows respect. And respect is something you can't fake. It's earned." Seagal took a deep breath, his eyes flicking back to the group of fallen gang members. His gaze softened as he turned back to the clerk. "You're the kind of man who understands that true power doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to be backed by fear." Seagal looked around the room again, his eyes passing over the broken thugs. "From now on, you're in charge here," he said to the clerk, his tone quiet. but firm. This place needs someone who understands humility, who understands what real strength is. You're the new manager. The clerk's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Seagal was already walking out the door. The bartender, still stunned by the turn of events, looked to the clerk, then back to the door, before finally nodding in acknowledgement. As Seagal exited, the sound of the bar's door swinging closed felt like the final punctuation of a lesson well learned. Jimmy, now on his knees, shaking with both pain and humiliation, couldn't even look up. The gang was broken, and the people who had witnessed this moment, they would never forget it. Seagal had shown them all what it meant to stand firm without raising a fist. He had proven that true strength came from within, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was to remain calm, take control, and walk away. The bar, once filled with tense silence, was now buzzing with confusion and disbelief. Jimmy and his gang were still sprawled across the floor, nursing their bruises and broken egos. Their once imposing demeanor had vanished, replaced by the humbling realization that their reign of terror had come to a sudden violent end. But the shock didn't end with their defeat. The bartender, the patrons, and the old clerk were still processing the surreal spectacle they had just witnessed. They were trying to understand how one man so seemingly unremarkable had torn apart the gang without breaking a sweat. It wasn't just Seagal's martial arts expertise that stunned them. It was his control, his calm presence in the face of aggression, his ability to remain unfazed by the chaos that surrounded him. To them, it was as though they had just witnessed a masterclass in what it meant to truly be powerful. Just as the last whispers of disbelief began to settle, a car pulled up outside the bar, its engine growling through the quiet evening. A sleek black sedan came to a stop, and the soft hum of the city outside seemed to fade into the background. The door to the bar opened again, but this time the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't just a man walking in for a drink. These were business, like steps, purposeful and deliberate. 3 men dressed in sharp suits rushed into the bar, their faces serious as they scanned the room. The bartender blinked, momentarily unsure of what he was witnessing. The trio looked like they belonged in boardrooms, not dive bars. They weren't the usual crowd. Seagal, who had been quietly making his way toward the exit, stopped as soon as he saw the group enter. A brief flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. He turned to face them, nodding ever so slightly, but it was enough to get their attention. "Mr. Seagal, sir," one of the men called out. His voice was filled with urgency, yet it carried a note of respect. A respect that instantly piqued the curiosity of everyone in the room. The men approached Seagal with business-like precision, one of them handing over a stack of documents. The other 2, their faces a mixture of deference and admiration, stood a little further back. The atmosphere in the bar changed instantly. The gang members who had been too ashamed to move now sat up, mouths agape. Even Jimmy, who had been barely able to lift his head, managed to catch a glimpse of the exchange. "Mr. Seagal, we've been waiting for you, sir," the first man continued, almost breathless with the formality of it all. "We've completed all the necessary paperwork. Everything is in order for the transfer." Seagal turned to face the men, his gaze cool and composed. His demeanor hadn't changed at all. He was still the same calm, collected figure that had walked into the bar earlier, without any hint of the storm he had just unleashed. There was something almost unsettling about his presence, how unaffected he seemed by the chaos he had caused. "Thank you," Seagal said simply, taking the papers from one of the men and scanning them briefly. He looked up, his eyes piercing through the room once again, but this time his focus was on the gang. Jimmy's eyes widened in sudden realization. He looked at Seagal and then back at the 3 suited men, his mind racing to put the pieces together. It didn't take long. A cold sweat began to form on his forehead as his voice faltered, barely a whisper. "Wait, Mr. Seagal? You're the one who owns this place?" Seagal didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang in the air, watching as the pieces clicked into place for Jimmy and the rest of the gang. The suited men exchanged glances, their posture straightening as they stood in quiet solidarity with Seagal. The gang, who had spent the evening mocking and threatening him, now realized they had just insulted the owner of the entire establishment. The very man they had thought was an easy target. Seagal took a slow breath and, with a calmness that was almost eerie, replied, "That's right. I'm the new majority owner of this bank." The revelation hit like a freight train. The room fell into stunned silence. The gang members froze, unable to comprehend the enormity of their mistake. The bartender, still processing the earlier violence, looked from Seagal to the three men who had entered, the pieces finally clicking together in his mind. A murmur spread through the bar. "He's the owner." One of the patrons whispered to another. "No way, Jimmy," now fully aware of the scale of his blunder, started to tremble. His face turned pale as the realization sank in. He had not just insulted a random customer, he had just humiliated the man who controlled everything he had once thought he owned. The gang's power, their authority, their ability to terrorize others. It all meant nothing now. Seagal didn't seem to be in any rush. His calm gaze turned to the gang, his voice even quieter than before, yet carrying more weight than any shout could. "I came here tonight to make a simple deposit," he said. "But now, I think I'll be making a change." The gravity of his words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Jimmy tried to speak, his voice shaky as he stammered. "Please, Mr. Seagal, I didn't know. I didn't know." Seagal didn't spare him a glance. Instead, he nodded to the clerk who had quietly stood by throughout the entire ordeal. The clerk, who had shown respect when no one else had, stepped forward, his expression calm but filled with something that could only be described as quiet strength. Seagal's gaze settled on the clerk, and he spoke the words that would change the course of the bar's future. "From today, you're the new branch manager," Seagal said, his voice firm yet unassuming. "You've earned it." The clerk's eyes widened in disbelief. He glanced around, his expression one of shock, but Seagal's eyes were unwavering. It was clear to him that this was no empty gesture. The clerk had earned this, not because of his position or his status, but because of his respect, his quiet dignity in the face of chaos. Jimmy, on the other hand, could barely lift his head. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by a sinking feeling of dread. He had been handed a lesson he would never forget. "Wait, please, I'm sorry," Jimmy pleaded, his voice breaking as he looked at Seagal. I didn't know who you were." Seagal's face remained calm, his eyes almost sympathetic. "That's exactly the problem, Jimmy," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to." Without another word, Seagal turned to leave. His presence seemed to command the entire room, the weight of his actions leaving an impression on everyone present. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The gang had been defeated, not by brute force, but by the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to prove. And as the last echoes of the night settled into the bar, everyone knew that the power in this room had shifted forever. The bar was still. The sounds of distant traffic and the occasional murmur from the street outside seemed far away, as though the world had shifted and paused, holding its breath. In the wake of Seagal's departure, everything had changed. The gang was broken, humiliated, their bravado and terror undone in mere moments by one man's quiet, deliberate actions. The patrons, once quiet spectators, now stared at one another, unsure of what to say or do. Jimmy, once the king of this bar, the man whose name was spoken with fear on the streets, was now a shadow of his former self. His face was ashen, his body hunched low as though he could no longer muster the strength to stand tall. His gang, once loyal and imposing, now lay around him, nursing wounds both physical and emotional. Their swagger had been wiped out in one swift, silent lesson, and there was nothing they could do but sit in their shame. Seagal's words echoed in the room, each syllable a reminder of what they had lost, and what they had failed to understand all along. Power doesn't come from fear. It comes from control. For the gang, it was an empty space now, a void where once there had been confidence and dominance, and yet, their self-inflicted downfall wasn't just painful for them. It was humbling for everyone who had witnessed it. The bartender, still standing behind the counter, hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were fixed on the scene, taking in everything. The tension, the violence, the revelation, and now, the aftershock. He had served countless thugs, criminals, and rough people over the years, but never had he witnessed a transformation as sharp as this. He had heard the rumors about Seagal, the quiet, powerful figure who had amassed untold wealth and influence, someone who could change the world without ever having to raise a fist. But seeing it firsthand, feeling it in the atmosphere, was something else entirely. The old clerk, the one Seagal had so quietly and unexpectedly appointed the new branch manager, stood near the back of the room. His hands were folded in front of him, his eyes never leaving the spot where Seagal had stood just moments before. The change that had come over him was subtle but undeniable. He had been a passive observer of life for so long, the kind of man who had learned to keep his head down, to do his work quietly and without fanfare. But now, he had been thrust into a position of authority, one that carried not only responsibility, but a sense of purpose. The clerk's breath was shallow, his heart still racing from the whirlwind of events. He had never expected this, never thought he would be chosen, let alone in such a dramatic and sudden way. But Seagal's words had been simple, yet heavy. "You've earned it." He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the remnants of the gang. They were broken, defeated, and humiliated. They were nothing now, not because Seagal had physically overwhelmed them, but because their entire world had come crashing down around them. Their power, which had been built on intimidation and fear, had been exposed as fragile and fleeting. The clerk swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Seagal's decision settle upon him. This wasn't just a promotion, it was a chance to right the wrongs of this bar, to bring a sense of dignity and respect back into the place that had long been tainted by greed and fear. The gang members, still nursing their wounds, exchanged nervous glances. Jimmy, who had been slumped against the counter, his face buried in his hands, slowly lifted his head. He looked around at his men, all of whom appeared just as lost as he was. "Do you know who that was?" One of the gang members asked quietly, his voice shaky. "That guy. He's not just some random guy. He's Seagal, the owner of this place. Hell, he owns half the damn city, and we just humiliated him." Another gang member, nursing a bruised jaw, nodded grimly. "We messed up big time." Jimmy, struggling to find his words, looked around at the gang. His pride, the thing that had once fueled his every move, was now in pieces. He had been the king of this place, the one everyone feared, and yet now, here he was, kneeling before a man he'd thought was weak, just because he had been calm, collected, and quiet. The truth was, Jimmy had mistaken silence for weakness. He had thought that because Seagal hadn't reacted to his insults and aggression, he was someone to be looked down upon. But Seagal had never been weak. His silence had been a choice. The choice of someone who understood something far deeper than Jimmy ever could. Jimmy's mistake had been assuming that loudness equaled power. The gang members, still shaken, slowly got to their feet, each one feeling the weight of their actions. They were all aware of what had happened here tonight, the unspoken truth that hung heavily in the air. The bartender, who had finally found his voice, cleared his throat and spoke. "You're all lucky," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "If it weren't for Mr. Seagal, you'd all be out on the street by now. You think you can walk into a place like this and treat people like they're nothing. You think you can just take what you want because you're bigger, tougher, or scarier. That's not how it works anymore." The gang members were silent, each one absorbing the bartender's words. They could feel the shift in the room, the change that had come over the bar. It wasn't just about the physical defeat, it was about respect. Something they had never truly understood until now. The old clerk, now standing with a newfound sense of purpose, cleared his throat. He walked over to Jimmy, who was still kneeling, his eyes locked on the floor. "You and your men are out of here," the clerk said firmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a strength that surprised even him. "I'm the manager now, and I don't tolerate this kind of behavior in my bar." Jimmy looked up, his pride shattered, but he knew he had no choice but to leave. The clerk had spoken with the quiet authority that Seagal had imparted, and he knew that if he didn't walk out, there would be nothing left of his dignity. Slowly, one by one, the gang members filed out, their heads down, their eyes avoiding the judgment of those who had once been beneath them. Jimmy was the last to leave. He stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes fixed on the clerk. I don't know what to say," Jimmy muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to. But you did," the clerk interrupted quietly, "and that's why you're leaving." As the last of the gang members walked out, the room finally felt peaceful again. The tension, which had been so thick just moments before, was gone. The bartender took a deep breath, the weight of the evening finally lifting. And the old clerk, now the new manager, stood tall, ready to restore dignity and respect to a place that had been marked by arrogance and fear for far too long. The lesson had been learned, not through violence but through humility. The gang had thought they were strong. They had thought they were invincible. But in the end, it was the quiet strength of one man that had broken them. And now, things would be different. The bar, the gang, the entire neighborhood. They had all been changed by Seagal's simple act of control. Seagal hadn't just won a fight. He had shown them all what it meant to be truly powerful, and more importantly, what it meant to be truly humble. The bar, now calm, stood in stark contrast to the chaos it had witnessed only hours before. The sound of broken glass and the angry shouts of gang members had long since faded. What remained was silence. But not the empty kind of silence that had hung thick with tension before. This was a quieter, more contemplative silence. One that carried with it the weight of lessons learned, of egos shattered, and of a power shift that would not be easily forgotten. Outside, the rain had started to fall again, tapping gently against the windows, as though nature itself was reflecting the change that had taken place. The city streets, which had once echoed with the sounds of fear and intimidation, seemed to hum with a newfound energy, as if even the world outside knew that something important had just happened inside the bar. The bartender stood at the counter, wiping down the same spot he had been scrubbing all night. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, as he processed everything he had witnessed. It wasn't just about the fight. It wasn't just about Seagal walking in and taking control with a single, calm gesture. No, it was deeper than that. The fight had ended, but the true transformation had taken place within the people in that room. Within the gang, the patrons, and even the bartender himself. Everyone had been witness to something rare. The realization that true power didn't come from intimidation, from loud boasts or aggressive postures, but from quiet strength and self-control. The old clerk, now the new manager, was still standing at the back of the bar, his posture straighter, his face more determined than before. The weight of Seagal's decision had settled over him, and he understood now the true responsibility that had been handed to him. It wasn't about managing the bar. It wasn't about maintaining order or making sure the cash register balanced. It was about restoring respect to a place that had been tarnished by arrogance. Seagal hadn't just chosen him for his experience or his position. He had chosen him for his humility, his dignity in the face of chaos. The clerk hadn't wavered when the gang had surrounded Seagal. He hadn't looked down or tried to hide. Instead, he had simply observed, recognizing the truth in Seagal's quiet presence. And now, Seagal had entrusted him with the power to make a real change, not just in the bar, but in the entire neighborhood. As the last of the gang members slowly disappeared into the rain-soaked streets, the clerk turned to face the bartender, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "It's going to be different now," he said. "Things won't be the same. We're not going to allow this kind of fear to take root again." The bartender nodded, still processing everything that had happened, but already feeling the shift. "I know," he replied. "I don't know what it was about him. He didn't fight like we thought he would. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. But he was. He was in control, and that's something I haven't seen in a long time." The clerk took a deep breath, steadying himself. "That's the real lesson here. True strength doesn't come from shouting or throwing punches. It comes from being able to stay calm when everyone around you is falling apart. It's knowing when to walk away and when to act." The bartender smiled faintly. "I think I get it now." Outside, the rain intensified, the streets illuminated by the glow of streetlights. The world continued to move, but inside the bar, time seemed to stretch out. It was a moment that felt almost sacred, like the room itself was holding its breath, allowing the transformation to take root. The clerk turned back to face the room. He didn't see the broken gang members anymore. He saw the potential for change. The patrons who had watched the fight unfold, who had seen the strength and the power in Seagal's calm, were already talking among themselves, processing the lesson they had just witnessed. They were beginning to understand that the world wasn't run by fear or intimidation. It was run by respect. And respect wasn't something that could be demanded through violence. It had to be earned. As the hours passed and the night deepened, the bar began to fill with people again. New faces, all settling into their seats with a sense of unease and curiosity. They had heard the stories. They had seen the aftermath of the gang's defeat, and though most of them hadn't witnessed the fight firsthand, they could feel the shift in the air. They knew that something had changed, something that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. The clerk moved behind the bar, taking his place at the counter. It felt right. It felt like the beginning of something important. He had been given this responsibility not because he was the loudest or the toughest, but because he had shown the strength of quiet dignity. He knew the work ahead would be difficult. The bar had been a place of violence and intimidation for far too long. But now, with Seagal's lesson in mind, it was his turn to steer it toward something better. The bartender walked over and placed a hand on the clerk's shoulder. "You're ready," he said quietly. "I can see it now." The clerk looked up, meeting his eyes, and nodded. "It's time for a change, and it's time for this place to start living up to the respect it deserves." The night passed slowly, but with each passing moment, the bar began to transform. The shadows that once lingered in the corners of the room seemed less oppressive, the air less tense. The patrons who had once feared the gang and their power now found themselves at ease. They felt a sense of hope, a sense that they could once again walk into the bar without the weight of fear hanging over them. And as the last few customers trickled out into the rainy night, the new manager stood behind the bar, looking around at the space he would now guide. There was still work to be done, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He knew that. Just like Seagal, true power wasn't about being loud or violent. It was about control, respect, and the ability to remain calm when the world was at its most chaotic. As he wiped down the counter, he felt the weight of Seagal's lesson settle deep within him. True strength, after all, wasn't something you had to prove. It was something you simply were. And now, in the quiet of the bar, the lesson was finally clear. The strongest people in the world are the ones who don't need to prove anything at all. With that, the door swung open once more, and the bartender and the clerk shared a quiet look. The night had ended, but a new chapter had just begun. And this time, it was going to be different. True power, after all, came from the inside.